The moment my mother stepped out of the car, I knew this was going to be harder than I thought. Eleanor "Ellie" Carter had spent 27 years as a cop, most of it as Boston's first female police chief, and she was the toughest person I had ever known. But major back surgery doesn't care how tough you are. Her movements were slow, her grip unsteady as she reached for my arm, her stubborn pride barely letting her lean into me for support. Even as she forced a smile, I could see the tension behind it, the quiet war she was waging against her own body. She hated needing help. Hated looking weak. But right now, she was both. "You sure this isn't too much trouble, sweetheart?" she asked, wincing as she stepped forward. "Of course not," I said, forcing a smile as I adjusted her weight against me. "The guest room is all set up. You'll be comfortable in no time." I didn't mention how small she looked, how fragile in a way I had never seen before. Instead, I focused on getting her inside, grabbing her medical equipment from the trunk as quickly as possible. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, a chill ran down my spine, an instinct I couldn't explain. I turned my head slightly, and there she was. Across the street, standing stiff-backed with her clipboard in hand, was Karen Lancaster. HOA president. Community tyrant. A woman who had spent the last 8 years making everyone's lives miserable. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, her blouse crisp and pressed, her expression blank except for the tight, forced smile curling at the edges of her mouth. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She just watched. "Who's that?" Mom whispered, following my gaze. I clenched my jaw. Karen Lancaster. HOA president. Thinks she runs this place. Mom didn't say anything, but I caught the flicker of recognition in her expression, the years of instinct kicking in. She had dealt with people like Karen before, power-hungry, self-important, the type who lived for control. I just hoped she was right. Because by sunrise the next morning, there was already a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. I ripped the violation notice off my front door, my pulse pounding as I read the fine print. Unauthorized resident change, fine, $100 per day until resolved. It wasn't just a warning. It was an attack. A calculated, deliberate move. Karen Lancaster hadn't wasted any time. My mother had been here for less than 24 hours, and the HOA was already coming after us. I exhaled sharply, crumpling the notice in my fist. This was a mistake. A misunderstanding. Reasonable people would understand that my mother wasn't some random tenant, she was here to recover from major surgery. I'd explain the situation, and they'd clear it up. But Karen wasn't reasonable. By the afternoon, my phone was already lighting up with messages from Ryan Mitchell, one of the only sane voices on the HOA board. "Ryan, Karen just called an emergency board meeting about your mom. She's claiming her medical equipment is a neighborhood aesthetic issue." I stared at the screen, disbelief giving way to a slow, simmering rage. Aesthetic issue? My mother had a hospital-grade oxygen machine and a portable wheelchair ramp. It wasn't like I had parked a rusted-out pickup truck in my front yard. Then another message. "Ryan, watch your back. She's going door to door, pointing at your house." I walked to the window, my jaw tightening. Sure enough, Karen was outside, clipboard in hand, speaking to neighbors. Every so often, she'd gesture toward my house, nodding like she was discussing something very serious. I knew what she was doing. She was poisoning the neighborhood against me. That night, the calls started. 3 different neighbors messaged me, apologizing, saying they couldn't get involved. By morning, I knew why. A second HOA notice arrived, but this one wasn't just for me. It was for the entire neighborhood. Karen had pushed through a new HOA bylaw overnight, an emergency measure called the Community Harmony Ordinance. It stated that anyone associating with a resident in violation of HOA policies could also be fined. She wasn't just coming after me. She was coming after anyone who dared support me. I saw the effect immediately. People who had once waved when I walked by suddenly avoided eye contact. One elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, had been by that morning to drop off homemade soup for my mother. By noon, she had a $50 fine in her mailbox. That was when I knew. This wasn't just HOA policy. This was personal. And Karen wasn't done yet. The next morning, I opened my door to two uniformed officers from Animal Control. "Miss Carter," one of them said, shifting awkwardly. "We received a complaint about an aggressive animal on the property. We need to conduct an inspection." I blinked. "Excuse me?" The officer cleared his throat. The complaint mentioned a large, dangerous dog seen outside the property. Specifically, a threat to community safety. For a moment, I just stared at him, waiting for him to realize how ridiculous this was. "I don't own a dog." The officer hesitated, glancing past me, like he half expected a rabid pit bull to lunge at him from my living room. "I understand, ma'am, but we still have to follow up on all reported concerns." That's when I saw her. Across the street, standing with her arms folded, watching with thinly veiled amusement, was Karen. She even had the audacity to wave. My jaw clenched. This was her next move. I had refused to back down, so she was escalating, using official channels to harass me under the guise of following protocol. I turned back to the officer, keeping my voice calm. "There must be a mistake. I don't have a pet. And I'd like to know exactly who filed this complaint." The officer sighed, shifting again. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't disclose that information." "Of course." I took a slow breath, forcing my hands to unclench. "Well, since I don't have a pet, I assume this case is closed." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "For now." His gaze flickered toward the oxygen machine visible through the doorway. His expression softened slightly. "Look," he said in a lower voice, "I don't know what's going on here, but complaints like this? They don't just happen. Someone's targeting you." I swallowed hard. "I know." As he walked back to his car, Karen called out in her syrupy sweet voice. "Everything okay, Rachel? No dangerous animals inside, I hope?" I ignored her, slamming the door. But I had barely caught my breath before another letter arrived the next day. This time, it wasn't a fine. It was a legal notice from the HOA, claiming that my driveway was actually community property and that I was in violation of property boundaries. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Karen was trying to get me kicked out of my own home. I woke up to the sound of gasping. For half a second, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, a sharp, shallow wheeze. My mother. I bolted upright, my heart slamming against my ribs as I fumbled to switch on the bedside lamp. The dim glow revealed her hunched over, her fingers weakly clutching the oxygen mask that had slipped from her face. Her breathing was ragged, uneven. The monitor beside her was flashing red, the oxygen levels dropping fast. Panic surged through me. "Mom! Stay with me." She tried to speak, but all that came out was a strained, wheezing whisper. I didn't waste another second. 911, my fingers trembled as I pressed the numbers. My mother, she just had major back surgery. Her oxygen levels are dropping fast. The dispatcher's voice was calm, controlled. "An ambulance is on the way. Stay with her. Keep her upright. Help is coming." I clutched my mom's hand. "Just hold on, Mom. They're coming." Then I heard it. A car door slamming outside. At first, I thought it was the paramedics arriving. I half ran to the window, expecting to see flashing lights, but my stomach turned to ice. Karen's black Escalade was backing into my driveway. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Why? Why now? Then it hit me. She was blocking the ambulance on purpose. I sprinted to the front door, throwing it open, my bare feet hitting the pavement as I ran across the lawn. The night air was freezing, but all I could feel was the burning rage surging through me. I pounded on Karen's door so hard it rattled on its hinges. Karen! Move your car. Right now. There was a long pause before the door finally cracked open. Karen stood there, blinking slowly, wrapped in a silk robe, as if I had just woken her from a deep, peaceful sleep. Rachel, she sighed, rubbing her eyes. Do you have any idea what time it is? I could barely breathe. My mother was dying, and this woman wanted to act inconvenienced? Move. Your car, I snarled. The ambulance is almost here. My mother can't breathe. Karen tilted her head slightly, eyes flicking to the end of the street, where, in the distance, the flashing red and white lights of the ambulance were fast approaching. And then I saw it. The way her lips curled ever so slightly. She was enjoying this. Oh, Rachel, she tooted, shaking her head. You really should have requested prior approval for emergency vehicles. It's in the bylaws. Section 12, paragraph 8. I almost lost it right there. You're quoting bylaws at me while my mother is struggling to breathe? Karen gave me a small, lazy shrug, then glanced back toward the ambulance, as if she was debating whether she felt like moving. Behind me, the sirens grew louder. The paramedics would be here in seconds. But they couldn't reach my mother with Karen's SUV blocking the only direct path to the house. I turned and ran back toward the street, waving my arms frantically as the ambulance pulled up. They saw it immediately, the black Escalade completely cutting off the driveway. One of the paramedics, Eric Donovan, cursed under his breath. We'll have to go around, he shouted, grabbing the stretcher and moving as fast as he could through my neighbor's yard. Their boots crunched against the frozen grass as they pushed forward, losing precious seconds. And then I saw Karen do something that made my blood run cold. She pulled out her phone. And started recording. I was frozen in disbelief as she turned the camera on herself. As you can see, board members, she said, her voice syrupy sweet, this is exactly what happens when residents fail to follow proper procedures. Unauthorized guests. Unregistered medical equipment. And now they want to blame the HOA for their lack of planning. I saw red. I lunged for her phone. Karen yanked it away, laughing. You're insane, I whispered. Karen just smiled. Rules are rules. Behind me, the paramedics finally reached the porch. I turned to help them, forcing my rage down, focusing on my mother. One of the paramedics strapped an oxygen mask over her face. His voice was tight. BP is dropping fast. We need to transport her now. Another paramedic, a tall guy named Mike, turned to me. Why is that woman still in the way? I took a shaky breath. She thinks she's above the law. Mike didn't hesitate. He pulled out his radio. Dispatch, be advised, possible obstruction of emergency services. Requesting police backup. And for the first time, Karen's smile faltered. Karen took a step back, her smirk faltering for the first time since this nightmare began. The radio crackled again as dispatch confirmed police units were en route. The lead paramedic, Mike, turned his body slightly toward me, keeping his voice low but firm. Rachel, we'll get your mom stable, but if she had lost consciousness for even a minute longer, he let the sentence hang, the unspoken words punching me in the gut. I knew. I knew exactly how close I had come to losing her. My hands curled into fists as I turned back to Karen, who was still standing there, gripping her phone like it was some kind of legal shield. The flashing ambulance lights reflected in her eyes, her mind clearly racing. I could see it, the gears turning, trying to find a way out, trying to twist the situation in her favor. And then she did something I never saw coming. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out an envelope, a thick one, stuffed with cash. Without hesitation, she extended it toward Mike. "Let's not blow this out of proportion," she said smoothly, her voice slipping into that same fake, HOA charm. "We're all just neighbors here. I'm sure we can work something out." Mike froze for half a second, then very deliberately reached down and pressed the button on his body camera. "I'm going to need you to repeat that, ma'am," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Karen's face went dead white. Her eyes flicked to the blinking red light of the recording device, and for the first time all night, she looked truly afraid. She stammered, pulling her hand back so fast it was almost comical. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. I was just trying to expedite the situation." Mike raised an eyebrow. "By handing me a cash-filled envelope after deliberately blocking an ambulance?" Karen forced a laugh. "It's a misunderstanding." "Oh, I completely understand," Mike said. His voice was sharp now, clipped. He turned slightly, angling the camera directly at her. "I understand that you knowingly obstructed emergency medical services, and now, you're attempting to bribe a first responder." The color drained from Karen's face. She knew. She knew she had just stepped way too far over the line. A fresh set of police sirens cut through the night air. Within seconds, a squad car screeched to a stop in front of my house, blue and red lights illuminating the scene. The moment Officer Mark Reynolds stepped out of the car, his expression darkened. I had known Mark since I was a kid. He had been one of my mother's best officers back when she was still on the force. And right now? He didn't look happy. He took one look at the situation, the ambulance parked at an awkward angle, the paramedics rushing to load my mother inside, Karen still clutching her damn clipboard, and his jaw clenched. "Who called this in?" he asked. Mike turned to him. "I did. This woman," he pointed directly at Karen, intentionally blocked the ambulance from reaching a critical patient. When confronted, she then attempted to bribe me. Mark's entire demeanor shifted. His nostrils flared, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. Karen laughed. A brittle, forced sound. "Oh, come on, Officer Reynolds. You know me. I'm simply enforcing HOA policy. The bylaws clearly state." "I don't give a damn about your bylaws, Karen." That shut her up real fast. Her mouth opened and closed, her hands tightening around her clipboard like it was some kind of legal shield. I saw the way she shifted her weight, how she glanced toward her house. She was thinking of running. Mark must have seen it too because he took a deliberate step forward. "Karen Lancaster, you are under investigation for obstruction of emergency services and attempted bribery of a first responder." Karen whipped her head toward me, eyes blazing. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You have no idea what you've just done." I met her glare head-on. "Neither do you." Mark stepped in, pulling out his handcuffs. "Ma'am, if you refuse to comply, I will detain you for further questioning." Karen didn't move. She stood there, shoulders squared, jaw clenched, as if sheer willpower could make this go away. And then, from somewhere inside the neighborhood, a voice shouted, "Check the HOA funds." Heads turned. I twisted to see where the voice had come from, but I couldn't make out the face in the growing crowd of neighbors who had come out to watch the chaos unfold. But then another voice rang out. "She's been running a scam for years." Another. "She fined my mother for leaving her porch light on." And another. "She told me I couldn't plant tomatoes in my backyard." The murmurs spread like wildfire. People were stepping forward now, emboldened, angry. They weren't afraid anymore. Karen turned in a slow, stunned circle, realizing just how outnumbered she was. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist. But now? She had lost control. Mark's radio crackled. Another unit was on the way. Karen's face twisted into something ugly, something desperate. Then she did the last thing I ever expected. She turned to Officer Reynolds, reached into her robe, and pulled out a second stuffed envelope. "I can make this worth your while," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just forget this whole thing." Mark didn't even hesitate. He turned his body camera on. "Ma'am," he said, flat and emotionless, "did you just attempt to bribe a law enforcement officer?" Karen froze. The entire street fell silent. Then, for the first time in her life, Karen Lancaster had no words. Mark sighed, shaking his head. "Turn around." And then, just like that, he snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists. I exhaled slowly, watching as Karen Lancaster, the woman who had spent years tormenting this neighborhood, was finally escorted into the back of a police cruiser. A long silence settled over the street. Then, somewhere in the crowd, Greg Sullivan let out a low whistle. "Welp," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Guess we're gonna need a new HOA president." And just like that, the tension broke. A few people cheered. Others laughed. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt something close to peace. 2 weeks later, I walked into the HOA emergency meeting with my mother by my side. She insisted on wearing her full police uniform, despite still recovering, and I knew exactly why. She wanted them to see her for who she really was, not just a woman recovering from surgery, not just another resident bullied into silence, but a leader. A fighter. Someone who had spent decades upholding real laws, not the twisted rules Karen had weaponized against this neighborhood. The community center was packed, tension thick in the air. Dozens of neighbors filled the seats, some whispering, others watching the remaining HOA board members with folded arms. They weren't afraid anymore. They weren't looking at me like I was the problem. They were looking at the real problem, the empty chair at the front where Karen should have been. Doug Patterson, the acting HOA president, cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We're here tonight to address the recent events regarding our former president." He barely got the words out before Greg Sullivan stood up from the back. "We don't need to address anything," he called out. "We need to vote." The room stirred, murmurs turning into agreement. Greg turned to the crowd. "Who here believes Karen Lancaster should be permanently removed from the HOA board?" Hands shot up everywhere. The vote was unanimous. Karen Lancaster was officially stripped of all power. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about how we let things get this bad in the first place. My mother stood, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. "This isn't just about one person. This is about how power can be abused when there aren't checks in place. That ends tonight." She placed a folder on the table. "These are safety protocols used by HOA boards across the country. They protect residents from harassment, ensure emergency vehicles have unrestricted access, and prevent board members from abusing their positions. If this board wants to earn back this community's trust, you'll implement them immediately." A murmur spread through the crowd. People nodded. Some even applauded. Doug exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I motion to implement the Reynolds Emergency Safety Initiative." "Seconded," someone called out. "All in favor?" Every single hand went up. That was it. That was the moment the power shifted. By the next morning, Karen and her husband put their house up for sale. The woman who had once ruled over this community like a queen had lost everything: her position, her influence, and most importantly, her ability to control people through fear. The neighborhood changed after that. People talked again. Helped each other. Neighbors who once stayed silent out of fear now stood together, refusing to let another Karen rise to power. 1 month later, I was elected to the new HOA board. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to make sure no one ever went through what my mother and I did. And sometimes, when I pass by Karen's old house, now owned by a kind family with 2 kids and a dog, I wonder if she ever truly understood where real power comes from. Not from rules and fines. Not from a clipboard or a title. But from a community that finally decided to stand together. So what about you? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or a Karen who thought they were above the law? Share your experience below, let's see who had it worse.